Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast, brought to you by Robert Morris, a political expert and author, and Ruairi Rob, a man he found at a bus stop. So would you like to tell us what the More Freedom Foundation is?
Sure. The More Freedom Foundation is mostly me, though supported by an international network of folks who care a lot about geopolitics. But what I think that the More Freedom Foundation provides is just a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more leisure to talk about what's actually going on in the world. More freedom means a lot of things to me. Part of it, is born out of libertarianism that I discarded in my 20s or what have you. But it's come to mean more freedom in terms of perspective. And that's like the main thing. I don't claim to be any smarter than anybody else who looks at geopolitics. I certainly don't claim to be any better connected. But what I do claim is that I have more freedom from any agenda. I am completely independent. I get YouTube advertising, Patreon crowdfunding, and sales of my books. That is everything that supports the analysis that the More Freedom Foundation provides. And that is a lot more unique than you would think. I mean, we've got tons and tons of think tanks. We've got academia. We've got all kinds of sources of information. But to some extent, I would argue, I don't want to sound like too much of a just sort of angry punk rock teenager here, but to some extent they all are compromised. And some of them, most of them do extraordinary, very interesting, vital work. But what I think I am capable of doing as the More Freedom Foundation, as a source of information that actually is a little more independent, is I can actually step back and observe a few things about the world that I think a lot of people are missing.
Okay, thank you very much. What books have you written?
I've written a number of books, long essays, what have you. The ones that I'm most proud of are probably Fatka and the New Birth of American Empire, a publication I came out with about, it's coming up on 9 years ago now, which talked about the ways that American empire works. And I think this is one of the key things that I have been focused on and that many others miss, is that the true foundations of U.S. empire are not aircraft carriers or our China policy or whatever the heck it is we're doing in the Middle East. It's legal. It is bureaucratic. It involves a lot of stuff that's just honestly too boring for most people to take the time to look into.
Did we see probably the most brutal side of that when the sanctions on Russia?
Absolutely. I think the sanctions were a great sort of coming out party for just how much power the United States had, because it barely scratches the surface. I think that the extent to which the United States was able to get Europe and Japan, and I believe Korea, instantly on board with quite staggering sanctions related to Russia's foreign reserves and whatnot. That was a sort of a coming out party for what I'm talking about. And this has led in the subsequent year new actions, not just against Russia, but against China as well. But I think that these things are briefly mentioned, briefly looked at. I think back in March when this was first rolled out, the incredible new restrictions on Russia's foreign reserves. I think it was mentioned, folks mentioned that it was a big deal, but then people go back to talking about tanks and go back to talking about all manner of stuff that, like, frankly, just doesn't matter as much.
Well, it's the more tangible stuff. Like I keep hearing, I think it's particularly Republicans complaining about the spending sent to Ukraine. And I feel like that's just a drop compared to what's spent on the military in a year.
Of course. And what's interesting is that even with the amount of money that we spend on the military as a whole, it can end up a lot less significant than simple things that are happening at the Treasury Department. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, is a bureaucracy that has just become stunningly more and more powerful. We get a narrative of American decline, and I think that a lot of folks play into that. A lot of folks believe it because it's sexy, because it's scary.
Is there a purpose for that narrative?
Oh, well, the purpose of that narrative in the United States is to keep the US public scared
Mm-hmm.
and to convince the US public to give more money to the Defense Department. Oddly enough, it's actually not the Defense Department that provides the most power in the US government. It's things like the Treasury Department. It's
Mm-hmm.
things like the Southern District of New York, federal courts. It's the fact that the U.S. has a constantly growing, ramifying, and extending network of legal and financial power. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that was what my first publication was about, diving
Okay.
into just one small aspect of that that new U.S. empire called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And it would take a while for me to explain just how invasive that is. But put simply, after this law that was enacted back in 2011, I
Mm-hmm.
believe, um, the every bank in the world
Yeah.
is required to have a reporting relationship with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. Every bank in the, I mean, just think
It
about that.
kind of reminds me of, you know how US citizens outside of America still have to pay taxes to America?
Of course, and
Feels like that, but obviously on a much grander scale.
But that's it's interesting you mentioned that because that is intimately what FATCA is about. It's
Mm-hmm.
about the foreign accounts of U.S. taxpayers. So there's always been this strange requirement that for most taxation, for most countries, if their citizens move to another country, well, you still have your passport, but you pay taxes in the country you move to. I believe, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but for years it was the United States and Eritrea were the only countries that required their citizens who lived in other countries
Yeah.
to pay taxes. So FATCA is a enforcement mechanism for that does not look to the individual U.S. citizens. It holds every bank in the world responsible for reporting on any accounts of U.S. citizens that they may have. If
Okay.
you think about it, and as I wrote about this at length, it's an extraordinarily imperial measure. It's I could always have trouble pronouncing this, but it's extraterritoriality.
Well, it sounds
This
like a great
idea
way
that,
to spy on your citizens when they're having fun in other countries.
well, of course, it's certainly that. But what I find most interesting about it is it's essentially saying that nobody's allowed to have tax law in their
Beyond
own
America's
countries
remit.
beyond America's remit. Exactly.
Wow.
So that's just one. That's just one thing, and you would have expected many countries to object to this, and they did quietly. But most folks just knuckled under. That's just the
Mm-hmm.
law of the world. Is that no bank in the world is allowed to really function without having a reporting relationship with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. And that's just one small aspect. So that's
Mm-hmm.
certainly something that I focus on. If there's a general thing that the More Freedom Foundation focuses on that I think almost all other geopolitical analysts miss is that the United States is, for lack of a better way of putting this, the United States is in charge. We have been for quite some time. We have been and that power that the United States has over the world is steadily growing. And in some years, like in 2022, with Russia's just spectacular, catastrophic miscalculation
Mm-hmm.
of invading Ukraine, sometimes the mask slips a little bit, and we see just how much power the United States has been able to amass. But the U.S. Defense Department, the U.S. media, the U.S. government generally prefers to preserve this illusion of American decline, which is
Mm-hmm.
just not something that exists
Well,
as far as I'm concerned.
it reminds me of when you hear Romans talking about decline, and it was like 600 years before the fall of Rome.
Yeah, I think that's very on point. I think that's very on point. One of the to have power is to be worried about losing it,
True.
and I think that's very much I think part of that's natural, part of that's even healthy.
Hmm.
But the extent to which we were hiding the ball
Yeah.
in the modern United States, modern world political scene, I think is a bit unhealthy. And if we're going through my publications, there's my first really successful self-published book. It was called "Everybody's Lying About Islam," and
Hmm.
it just talks at length about what this whole. You remember the war on? Do you remember the war on terror, Rory? You
I
remember that was
I
a big
do I do
thing.
remember it.
Yeah,
I remember the
but
day it happened.
yeah. As do I, as do I. But from 2001 to sort of 2000, I mean, really until 2018, formally,
Yeah.
fighting terrorism was what the United States government and the United States military was primarily about. And what my book covers is how it was all mostly fantasy. What happened on 9/11 is that the United States was attacked primarily by Saudi Arabians,
Hmm.
by a um, organization with a Saudi ideology, led by Saudi Arabians, primarily funded by Saudi Arabians.
Wahhabism, is
And
it?
then, yeah, Wahhabism would be the state ideology
Hmm.
of Saudi Arabia. And just sort of talking about pretty much everything we had been focusing on in the 16 years between 2001 and when I published that book
Hmm.
was just a diversion to try to get people to pay less attention to the US Saudi relationship, which was really at the root of international jihadi terrorism or what have
Yeah.
you. And it was fascinating. It has been fascinating. And I predicted this to an extent, just watching the degree to which the salience of the war on terror has just slipped away.
Oh, absolutely. You
Um,
seem to hear nothing about it
um,
now.
I mean, with good reason. We've got better excuses now.
Was
One of my favorite.
Oh, just one
Sorry.
wee thing. I kept thinking that, a lot of, US policy is to try to sell weapons, and, there was the Red Scare. It almost felt like terrorism was just like an appetizer between another big enemy to come along.
I think that's very true. It was sort of just to keep the wheels spinning for a
Hmm.
little while. You could there's a concept in the energy transition. They call it a bridging fuel. Have you
Hmm.
heard this? You know, natural gas is supposed to be a bridging fuel. It's got lower emissions, and it's gonna the what terrorism was a bridging fuel
Hmm.
between the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the China fight that we're
Yeah.
all warming up for now. So really, this whole piece in the middle was just the whole terrorism thing was just a bridging fuel to keep things spinning over,
Hmm.
and with no real interest in attacking the real underlying sources of that terrorism, which were to be found mostly in Washington D.C. and Saudi Arabia. So that was one of my more successful publications.
Was there any book you have a real attachment to?
Well, I would say the book that I probably have the closest attachment to is my most recent book,
Hmm.
and I really wish it had done better. It did not, in fact. It's called "Avoiding the British Empire,"
Hmm.
and I think it's probably maybe just a little too long and a little too involved.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the key things that informs my perspective is the understanding that actually the United States runs a world empire that is just as, if not significantly more dominant than the British Empire that
Hmm.
ran the world during the 19th century. So you've got this system. The United States is actually strikingly similar to the British Empire. And unfortunately, I identify in this book that the United States is making a lot of similar mistakes to the mistakes that the British Empire
Well,
made.
they're almost like you could describe them as an offshoot, from their genesis,
Oh, for sure, for
because the
sure.
founding
They're
fathers
not.
all would have had English accents,
Oh, for sure, for sure.
and
It's
they acted very like the English did. Just they kept the money instead of it getting sent to Britain.
very true, very true. The ideologies, the culture, the
Hmm.
language, the even the legal systems. Really,
Oh
it's
yeah, yeah,
most European countries have a civil law system. The Americans and the British have a common law system.
yeah.
It's it's pretty striking. And what's interesting, and I get into it a bit in this book, is it was just more or less a straight up handoff in a lot of respects.
Mm-hmm.
Most explicitly, probably in the Middle East in the '60s, where the British would literally just hand over the keys to bases to the Americans.
Isn't that where the idea that the Iranians have, that Britain is like the Greece to America's Rome?
Oh, the Iranians are big on that as well.
Well, they sort of see that the Brits are the brains of the operation, while the Americans are the muscle. Well, it's believed that the British did a lot of the work to do the revolution in Iran, but then the Americans really went, this is a really good way to overthrow a country, and learned a hell of a lot from that, and then kind of went a bit on a overthrowing spree.
I think that's certainly a real possibility. There was a great period of time, I think FDR, under FDR,
Mm-hmm.
largely because with the Great Depression, there were too many other things going on. But I think this allowed for a bit of virtue, and there was this moment in the 1930s and the 1940s where the United States was a little too busy to run around toppling small
Yeah,
countries that didn't cooperate with our economic
that we're
plans.
trying to be
And I think
democratic.
yeah, exactly. And I think you can very quickly look at, Guatemala was 54, is that right? And then Iran is 53.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'd never really heard of it being seen as inspired by the British, but I could totally see that. Yeah, because it was just such a terrible decision and completely unnecessary, and
Yeah.
actually did not serve U.S. power very well, to be quite clear. But I think you're exactly right. There was this period in the early 50s where the United States was like, okay, now we're going to start overthrowing governments we don't like again.
I just remember
And it was,
it's probably one of the best, The Onion?
of course.
They have a scene where they make it look like it's, original, like 1950s footage.
After the British Honduras overthrow, several of our agents met at a CIA airstrip in the Costa Rican jungle. And as they did not receive an official hold and do not overthrow order, they organized an anti-government militia, of course, and proceeded to topple the government. So, little miscommunication there.
So once we got started, we just kept on going.
Well, it's sort of, there's the classic anti-drug ad campaign in the United States where, the father comes up and finds this kid with drugs, and the kid goes, "I learned it from watching you, Dad." And I feel like that's kind of the vibe with the United States and Britain, actually.
Absolutely.
It was very, and honestly, if you want to take it a little bit further, that's kind of the vibe with Russia and China.
Mm-hmm.
Russia and China have learned over the past 20 years from the United States that what it is to be a great power, what it is to be a country that matters, is to throw your weight around and to invade other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And China has thankfully not yet
Have
fully,
they not had bad history with it? They tried to take a wee bit of Vietnam and it didn't go well.
Didn't go well for them. No, it did not. But you can point to Xinjiang and what they're doing there. Certainly, a lot of the language they're using there is all just war on terror.
Yeah.
It's George W. Bush stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Putin specifically. I mean, he's trying to do. I've been talking about his invasion of Ukraine. It's a poor man's George W. Bush routine.
Well, yeah, but they're they're throwing everything at the wall. They're Nazis and they're terrorists, but they're also run by the Jews. It's sort of just, throw everything in there and see what happens.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, the Russian propaganda stuff is one of the things I find most interesting about it is just how informed it is by U.S. culture war political stuff. It's just like,
I've seen there's like a comedy show that's basically saying if you go to America, you'll be the lowest of the low because black people have to get compensated and gay people need compensated and, vegetarians. All your classic woke categories is like, oh, don't listen to those Americans. They're awfully silly.
Oh, I saw that there was some like the Russian government put out the that clip with the family on the plane to the United States, and they're all just
Yes.
horrified because of the gay marriage, and
Yeah.
they have to
Uh,
let a black person go ahead of them in line, and
exactly.
it's fascinating because it really speaks to the poverty of Russia's propaganda machines, just the intellectual poverty of it.
Well, I've
If they
heard a
have to
lot of it's all about keeping them disinterested. It's you want to keep your populace not really interested in politics in any way, shape, or form. Let us in charge. But also, you have to realize, I'm just sort of shocked at how the poverty in Russia, like how much probably doesn't have internet. And there's places that don't really have roads either. So they just get what the telly tells them. And if the telly tells them are all kind of nut jobs if you ever try to leave your little village, and then you see the massive wealths in Moscow. So it does, you could see like it is just a very poor man's America.
Wow. Yeah, that is an interesting. The parallels between Russia and the United States have always been kind of fascinating. I mean, a little silly. I mean, they're
Well,
fundamentally very different
I like to
places.
use some comparisons because I've heard a talk that if California hadn't had a gold rush, America would be very one-sided population-wise. I know you could argue it is, but like if you go to America, you'll find people nearly everywhere, while Russia is very one-sided towards Europe. Like hardly anyone lives in the Asian part, while there's still a huge amount of people live in, California, Washington State, and so on.
That's a very key, a very, very key difference,
Hmm.
and I think I'd never really thought about the gold rush that way, but I think that's pretty on point. I think that's fascinating. What's fascinating about the United States today, Rory, is that to a large extent, it actually is west of the Mississippi. It
Hmm.
is still largely depopulated. It's
Oh
just that
yes,
we've got a tremendous population center, a series of tremendous population centers up and down the west coast.
but it
But in
does
between,
it. Well, sorry, I was going to just one thing that we forget about in Ireland. It's incredibly mild climate. Most days are 20 degree or 15 degrees. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I apologize. And it might rain, but the center of America does have massive amounts of like tornadoes. I find it
Mhm.
strange. I was watching a YouTuber and he was like, it was just normal that it was hammered into him what you do when there's a tornado. And the fact when you're like, so much of that area will get destroyed at some point, you think, oh yeah, I can see why a lot of people don't want to live there.
I think there's something to that. I've spent some time in Oklahoma City
Hmm.
recently, and it's just a fact of life that
Yeah.
tornadoes will come running through. But also one of the dominating facts of the United States, and something that I often find myself emphasizing to folks who aren't from here, is it's just so gosh darn big.
Oh
It's
yes.
so fucking big. It is such a large, large country, and we've got so much space that just
But you're
isn't
able
filled. But I,
to
th- I
utilize it. Like it feels like if you go anywhere, although if it might be remote, it still looks like civilization. Like I know this will sound like a silly comparison, but there's a game called SnowRunner, and it's set in both Alaska and in Russia. And the representation of the towns in Alaska, you're sort of like, yeah, I could live here. This is just like, it's a remote area, yes, and it would be difficult, but it still feels like civilization. But everything in Russia is like, oh, this is like a medieval town where you can drive a lorry through it. Like it is just heartbreaking because I've heard comparisons that it is the most divided, or not divided, you have the largest discrepancy in wealth. Because people will say, they'll point to the very poor countries. But if you look at the richest person in that country, you're like, that's just like a middle class person in a rich country. Like their maximum wealth isn't that much. But when you see what the stuff the oligarchs get up to, and then you see that they're trying to steal toilets, like the Ukrainians were laughing that they were shocked that they had like toilets indoors. I just find it like the disparity in Russia is incredible.
It is pretty extraordinary just
Mm-hmm.
how Russia failed to hit the marks that it's been trying to hit for centuries at this point. It just sort of,
But has it
because
ever
Russia has
really
been,
tried to? I'm almost under the assumption that they're just Moscow proper is just pillaging everything from Russia, and now it's run out, so it's going to move into Ukraine. Like, you think you have the largest country in the world, and you're like, but you still want more land. It's just mind-boggling.
well, I think Moscow, I think perhaps the problem with Russia is that it's had so many different systems, so many different approaches, and none of them have really been that successful. I know there's some
Well, the
folks who
Soviet Union
argue
did
that
all right for a bit.
no, it did all right for a bit, but then it stagnated and
Hmm.
stagnated massively and started falling apart. And then we, whipsawed to go completely in a different direction. And I think Russia has been very poorly served by, honestly, both British and US imperial propaganda, because both the British and the US always been very invested in making Russia a lot more scary than it actually was.
Was
The whole great game concept between Britain and Russia in the 19th century is just a fantasy.
hmm what was the
Uh,
with the fall of the Soviet Union? What was the best things America did for Russia, and equally, what were the worst things that they did?
well, I think talking about good things, I think George H.W. Bush
Hmm.
had a pretty good sense of how to manage the end of the Cold War. I think he refused to act in a triumphal way. I think
Hmm.
when Soviet republics were splitting off and declaring independence, he had the good sense to say, "Oh, we want no part of that,"
Yeah.
and just step back and let stuff happen. I
Hmm.
think that George H.W. Bush's general approach of like, let's defer to Gorbachev as if he's still the all-powerful guy running a superpower. Let's not default into triumphalism. Let's
Yeah.
just sort of try to keep things as calm and peaceful as possible as this
Hmm.
is happening. I think that was the best,
Okay.
and especially just looking at the way that folks um, after him handled things. I think that it looks better and better by retrospect. Just George H.W. Bush just refusing to declare victory and
Hmm.
letting things evolve in a
Okay.
peaceful way rather than trying to push it around. That was
Yeah.
probably the best, I would say.
Okay. So, what do you feel were the worst things America done to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I think NATO expansion would be a big winner. I think it's
Okay.
just the assumption. What George H.W. Bush did so well was not declare victory, and what every U.S. president since seems to have been about
Hmm.
is just rubbing Russia's nose in how badly they lost. It's been demonstrated to my satisfaction, though it's a very controversial issue, that there was a commitment on the part of the United States to not expand NATO.
Hmm.
It wasn't in writing. There is a large industry of U.S. Professionals organized around excusing away that this commitment that I believe we made. But it seems pretty clear that that was a commitment we had made. And Bill Clinton, there's this great book on the foreign policy failures of the Clinton administration.
Hmm.
I think it's by David Halberstam. It's one of the classic best and the brightest guy. And it
Yeah.
was fascinating. I read that book years ago and I found it very useful. And it was fascinating that NATO expansion was mentioned in half a paragraph in this long book on the
Hmm.
Clinton. It just wasn't something that was even really thought about.
Yeah.
It's very clear to me that the benefits of NATO expansion for Eastern Europe. It's a form of insurance that
Well, definitely. Well, when
was
you see the way Finland's operated, it would appear that Finland has been terrified. Well, obviously they've been invaded before by, well, the Soviet Union then, but essentially Russia. Their whole ideology was a fear of being, everything. They kept talking about. They wouldn't talk about Russia when they were training. It was the enemy from the east. They would talk about. So you could see where you'd really want to get into a defensive alliance where you felt safe and secure and could, work forward and prosper.
100%. And I totally see the benefits of NATO accession and being a member of NATO for all of the Eastern European countries that have these horrific histories with
Yeah.
Russia. What I don't see are the benefits of expanding this anti-Soviet Union military alliance for the United States against a Soviet Union that had already been defeated.
Yes.
I think that it's very easy and very standard to say, well, look what Russia did. Thank God NATO is there. And I can't 100% dispute that. But I think that the confidence with which people assert that Russia would have been exactly as evil and exactly as aggressive if NATO weren't there, I don't think that's demonstrated at all. And I think when
Well, they did.
I get into
They did have
conversation,
Grozny very early on.
well, yes, but was part of Russia.
But
That was. No, I mean that's part of Russia, and also in the context of a country that had watched much of its what it had considered traditional Russian territory to sort of march off rather peacefully and quietly. And I think that even Grozny was a tremendous failure for Yeltsin.
The first war they did lose, and then they came back with their level everything strategy.
Indeed. But I think that the assumption that everything would have just been on a level of violent imperialism from Russia automatically is not at all borne out by. I think it's a counterfactual. Like, you can't really tell one way or the other. I think that I can't say for certain. I tend to think that the reason Vladimir Putin had as long a career as he did, the reason that Russia is being run by a lunatic revanchist, the reason that Vladimir Putin is both in power and as crazy as he is, I believe that to be NATO expansion. There's no way to ever prove that.
Oh yes.
But I think by the same token, there's no way to prove that without NATO expansion that any of this would have happened.
But do you think there's a limit to American power? Just sometimes it feels like, every pothole in Russia is, a CIA plot. Like, Russia is its own entity with its own thoughts and feelings and will do things somewhat regardless of what, the big powers will try to make it do.
Sure. I think Gorbachev had a range of expectations that were frankly ridiculous. Like, I think Gorbachev thought, well, I'm going to do this thing. And he did do an extraordinary thing. I mean, the Cold War ended. It was a little bit Ronald Reagan. It was a little bit Paul Volcker, but it was...
Well, they tried giving it to the people that ran, the managers that ran the factories to begin with, and then they just pillaged the factories.
True.
And then it became a bit more capitalist.
Well, I think Gorbachev expected that if he more or less unilaterally ended the Cold War, which is my read of what happened, that he would be able to expect from the United States and Western Europe a Marshall Plan, a lot of real help, real help. And I think, honestly, that expectation of his was kind of ridiculous. Like, there's very little in, I think Reagan and H.W. Bush were both very happy to work with him and pleased that he was so pleasant.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a real failure on Gorbachev's part to assume that the high Reagan, United States of America was going to, pull a Harry Truman and help rebuild Russia into a modern democratic capitalist system. Instead, we just sort of let it go.
Let it
and I do
happen.
think there's a lot of resentment in Russia against the United States for that I think is probably unfair to a degree. It's not,
Hmm.
like we didn't owe. It is an incredible gift that Gorbachev and Russia gave the world, that the Cold War ended without
Hmm.
annihilating
Well,
humanity.
huge
But
bloodshed. There still was some, sadly, but
well,
it.
I grew. I remember the '80s, and I remember the assumption that the world could just end
Yeah.
entirely. All 5 billion of us at any
Hmm.
point. So
Do you think Gorbachev
Yugoslavia,
was, a force for good more than he was for bad?
unquestionably, 100. He was an
Hmm.
extra. I think he's one of the greatest historical figures of the 20th century or any century. Was he good for Russia? Is a much more fraught question. But for humanity in general, I think it was extraordinary, and I think that's part of why I find NATO expansion so appallingly idiotic.
Would
Leave
a country
aside,
like Turkey be an example of a country that really shouldn't be in NATO?
well, but Turkey joined NATO in the 1950s.
Hmm.
The question of whether you were going to disband NATO in the 1990s, I don't think I would have gone that far.
Hmm.
But my problem is the additions to NATO thereafter, keeping in mind that Gorbachev had done this extraordinary thing. He had just been
Yeah.
like, let's go for peace. Screw it. Let's not kill the world. Like this
Hmm.
extraordinary choice. And there was this great Twitter thread going around in February talking about how just everybody from the current head of, Biden's current head of the CIA to Bob Gates, the least embarrassing Republican Secretary of Defense to Henry of this century, to Henry Kissinger, to George Kennan, the guy who
Hmm.
formulated the Cold War strategy. They were like, "Oh, for the love of God, do not expand NATO. This is this incredible betrayal." So
Yeah.
you had Gorbachev, who did this amazing, amazing pro-peace, saintly thing, and our response within 3 or 4 years was like, let's expand our anti-Soviet
Hmm.
military organization. And then, because that NATO expansion started in, I think it was the mid 90s. I want to say 1994,
So
sticks in there. Maybe
Bill
it was a year or
Clinton.
two later under Bill Clinton. And
Hmm.
then things just got worse from there. And yes, like when after NATO had expanded, Russia got a strongman. And that
Yeah.
strongman, as that strongman watched NATO continue to expand and expand from not just Eastern European countries into the Baltics under George W. Bush, territory that had, however unfairly, been part of the Soviet Union
Hmm.
and part of the Russian Empire before that, that strongman got worse and worse and worse. So, like this concept, I think when people talk about how NATO is just definitely the right thing to do, we get to this conception of, well, you have to understand that
Hmm.
Russia is just naturally evil and the Russians are just naturally imperial. And look at all of Russian history. Look at what the Russians have always been doing to Eastern Europe, and they're evil and bad. And really, what about Gorbachev? I
Yeah.
mean, Gorbachev was certainly a strange historical oddity, but he was also an extraordinary opportunity. And I think
Hmm.
Yeltsin was somebody you could meld into really anything,
Yeah.
and would have been a useful tool for the United States for anything the United States wanted to bring about. But no, we just sort of, continued to expand our weapons sales outfit and sort of pushed
Hmm.
Yeltsin around until the Russian political system threw up somebody who was a little less willing to get pushed around. So I think it's a really fundamentally sad story, but I think there's no question that NATO expansion was
A big factor.
a big factor.
Okay.
And I think probably a gamble that wasn't quite worth taking. But
Do
hey,
you
I could be wrong about that.
Okay. Do you think the 20th century has ended?
When did history end?
But you know how they
Yeah,
didn't they say it wasn't until the 1920s until the 19th century ended?
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
And
Of
now
course.
with Queen Elizabeth died
The
and
true end of the 20th
Gorbachev, I
century.
just think it's weird that they died in a similar amount of time, and they had a huge influence over the 20th century.
God, what a tragedy for Gorbachev to die during this. To
Oh
just
yes, like of all times to die.
just to be like just to the absolute wreck and ruin of
Well, because he lived a rather modest life from what I've seen, like, after his political career.
well, I've good with the famous Pizza Hut,
Yeah,
the Pizza Hut winnings.
it's a quite a interesting ad. There's more going on in it than, you just see the clip of him and you think, oh, isn't that sad? But when you watch the full ad, there's there's surprising amount to it, for a Pizza Hut ad. I think he's criticized in it, and he says, "But I give you the freedom to come here." It's really strange.
That's very dark. That's very dark.
Yes.
So sorry for those who may not. Gorbachev famously starred in a Pizza Hut ad in the 1990s in Russia that you can find on YouTube, which is very worth watching.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
But it is truly so. Gorbachev was a very old man. I mean, was he in his 90s when he died? But,
yeah.
But I could actually see him, to some extent, just sort of dying from a broken heart to sort of.
Oh, yeah. It's like everything's gone wrong.
His successor, because I believe he was half Ukrainian, half Russian, or grew up in Ukraine, is something that I'd seen. And
well, that's the other tragedy of this is one of the countries that loved Russia the most is the one that's now going to hate it more than anyone.
Oh yeah,
because the biggest amount of tourists that went to Russia were Ukrainians, because Ukraine had been doing quite well, and I think the average wage was higher than the average Russian wage, and the fact. I think in the past 10 years, it just sort of Russia kind of stagnated, and a lot of the neighbors had sort of slightly done better.
Well, yeah, it isn't that hard to do better than Russia.
But it's also just, like any neighbor, you have close ties. So, they're now going to be the most European American country going. Ukraine after this war is not going to want anything to do with Russia.
I think that seems pretty likely.
But if they had just been civilized, they could have had a wonderful relations with them.
Well, I think they tried for 20, 30 years. And I think the United States and Europe did a lot of work to get in the middle of that. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is absolutely inexcusable. But it's pretty clear to me that the United States has spent a couple decades working pretty hard to screw up the Russian-Ukrainian relationship, and it all paid off in February. So, yeah, which is an incredible tragedy. It's funny you mentioned that
horrendous.
You mentioned just sort of when did the 20th century truly end? I think in the national defense strategy, or is it national security strategy? I can't recall. Recently, I think they actually, or maybe this was just Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor for Biden, had mentioned that we are now in the post Cold War era. So whatever the post Cold War era is over.
Yes.
And we are now. Okay. What that actually means? I mean, who's to say?
It kind of reminds me of when you talk about modern art, you're not talking about current art. You're talking about a specific period of art that's referred to as modern art.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're no longer modern. We're contemporary now.
Yes.
Which is quite something, and something that I look forward to exploring on this podcast going forward for quite some time to come, I hope.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for your time. You've been very insightful, and I hope the listeners now know a little more about what the More Freedom Foundation is.
All right. Well, thank you kindly, and look forward to doing this again next week. Thanks so much, Ruairi.
All the best, Robert. And if you're happy with listening to Robert, you can catch him in many other forms on his YouTube channel and on TikTok under the More Freedom Foundation. And you can catch Robert on Twitter at RobOLaw. And he has written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, where he explains how America should avoid the decline that bestowed the British Empire. And you can catch me at your local bus stop. I'm Murray McElhone. I'll stop recording now.